Look at this lovely smock. My wife made that, isn't it great? Fisherman artist smock, gives me superpowers and it's got pockets. Kudos to her. So creative. She's amazing. She's the best wife. So welcome back to this series on Big Daft Skies. This is episode 4, where we're going to be doing a little bit more complex things with watercolour. We're going to be talking about lifting off in this episode. Specifically, we're going to talk about lifting off paint with a dry brush or lifting it off with tissue paper and what sort of effect you can use that for. It's going to be a really fun one, so let's go! So what I'm going to show you here is this first example, is I'm going to use a lift-off method to create some clouds. Now, what you need for this is some tissue paper, obviously watercolour paper, or any kind of paper, and some paint. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix up some cobalt blue high hot press paper. So this is very smooth paper, which means that it doesn't have a lot of texture on it. So theoretically you should be able to see, as I lift off the paint, you should be able to see that technique quite crisply. So let me show you how you can lift off paint to create clouds. And it's really simple. If you just basically bunch this up together to create like an irregular shape like that. Try not to be too tight with it. And you can just do this kind of texture across. How big or small you want the clouds to be will dictate the sort of size of tissue that you use. But if I start quite small and then just go quite big, and now I can press quite hard, you can see it's pulling the pigment off the page. So if I do the same sort of thing again there, just create some fluffy bits towards the end. Now if you can rub slightly, but you've got to be careful that you don't pull the paper. But the other way if you want to get some more pigment out of there, if you use a slightly dry brush, not too wet and clean, you don't want it too wet because you don't want it to bloom and go crazy, but what you can do is you can add a little bit more water just into that central section, and before it does anything crazy, get a pointed bit of tissue and just suck out that extra bit of water in there. And what you're doing is you're just lifting off. You're lifting off that that blue pigment, as you can see. So let's just try again with this. Now it's been sat there for a little bit longer and see. Yeah, so you can see now it's a bit drier. So it's not quite pulling off. It's pulling off some pigment still, but it's not quite pulling off as much. So of course you can use this for pulling out separate clouds, but you can also use this technique for actually removing, whole areas. If you wanted to create like a layer of mist. And again, you've got to be quite careful you don't damage the paper. If you're using good quality paper, you shouldn't have any problems. So what you're doing here is I'm just lifting out. Now if I go in here with some dry water, what am I saying? Insane. Yeah, powdered liquid water. If I go in here with some clean water, and again I can lift out even more of that, and then do the same thing again. Again, you have to work the water a little bit into the paper. Okay, and then one last time there. So this is, you can see there's someone there. So this is lifting out, but what you're still doing is keeping some quite nice sort of soft edges. Now while this is relatively damp still, you could add to your cobalt blue here, you could add a little bit of Van Dyke brown or something like that, or just some darker blue, and create some shadows, and you could add those in. See, now it's a little bit drier, it's not quite as dissolvey as it was before. I'll just dilute that a tiny bit. And again, if that's a little bit harsh, you can dab a little bit out if you don't want it to be quite as... Just want it a bit more subtle than that. We'll just take out a section. Break it up a little like that. There we go. So there's two simple clouds. Quite nice way of doing clouds. Personally, I prefer a more painterly way of doing it and a little bit more crazy. I think that's pretty, but I find it a little bit delicate for my sensibilities. But everyone likes different things. I mean, I think if you were just starting doing skies and you wanted to add some simple clouds and some simple details, that's a really good method, and it's certainly one I've used many times. Right, so I'm going to show you something similar, but not quite the same. So here I'm going to show you lifting off with a dry brush. Now this is a technique which you can use a lot in watercolour. It's just generally pretty useful. So I'm just going to mix a little bit more of this cobalt blue, and again we're going to do a flat wash on here. What I should do is actually, thinking about it, I should make this a tiny bit darker, because then it's going to be a little bit more, you'll be able to see a little bit more once where it's been lifted off. So right, so while this is still relatively wet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this brush. Give it a really good clean. Here, brush, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to soak out all the water, so give it a really good squeeze. Now these mop brushes, they're pretty absorbent, and what they will do is they will pull the pigment out of that area. And if you do the same thing again, clean water and then dry it, and you can pull the pigment off the page while it's still wet. Now if we try with a slightly more traditional brush, and like a longer bull brush again, and then we'll dry that off. Now this is a really nice way of creating sort of fluffy, and again dry that, really fluffy, slightly wind-swept clouds that you occasionally see in like the upper atmosphere on a summer's evening. And you can actually go quite small. If you were to go with a rigger brush, which is a really small brush, again I'm going to wet it and then dry it, you can actually pull out some quite fine pieces. And again, the brush just acts as a sponge, and if you lay it on the surface of the paper, it will just pull out that pigment. There you go. So anyway, you get the idea. Works very well, and I can show you some examples of that. So the other thing you can do is, if you want to create clouds, you can use a technique with sponge. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to form it into a tool like that, where I can sort of roll it on. And again, the thing to do with this is to wet it, partly to make sure that it's clean, and then we're going to squeeze that out. Let me dab it on a bit of tissue so it's nice and dry, and then we can go in and start creating some sort of shapes. Now obviously if you use the pointy bit, you can again create some sort of like slightly fluffy areas. The sponge technique is a lot of fun, and you don't have to be too, just dry that off again. You don't have to be sort of blobby with it. You can be slightly more, gestural like that. So there we have this. I've just dropped some water on there to create a very obvious background, which, as you can see in some of my other tutorials, is a fun way of doing clouds, but it's not hugely subtle. But what you can do is then you can use the sponge to sort of get rid of that pigment that sits on the outside of that. So actually, a sponge itself is quite a useful tool to have when you're watercolouring in general. I find it quite a handy thing to use. So that's the third way of creating clouds with a sponge. Right, so I'm going to dry all that off, and then we can have a reflection. Talking about imperfection, it's easier to model it than it is to talk about it, and I feel like I'm really doing that with this painting today. But there you go, I'm still having fun. What is that squeaking? So let me talk you through some of these finished pieces. Here we have a version where I've used tissue paper, some clean dry tissue paper, to lift off the water and pigment to create these white cloud shapes, and then I've added in a little bit of just dark, slightly darker watercolour under there. Now you can see, because this was the one I pulled out straight away when it was still wet, whereas this one I left to sort of semi-dry to a certain extent. So you can see that you really need to pull it off straight away if you want the white to work like that. So in this version here, what I've done is I've just used again some dry clean tissue paper, and I've lifted off with the tissue paper, and then I've used I dropped some water on it there, and then I used a dry clean brush as well to lift off some of the pigment there. This version, where I used some sponge. Now sponge is just as an effective technique for removing as tissue paper, and it again can give, depending on what sponge you're using, some nice irregular techniques. And like tissue paper, you can also use it to lift off and create sort of fluffy bits as well. Now this is probably, I might just add a little bit of white gouache onto that to finish that, but this is how to create those kind of like sun flares when you get late evening conditions. This again is just being pulled off. You can use tissue paper or again sponge or whatever to create like a morning mist. And here, just because I had a free space, I just did a very, very quick demo of just a little seascape, and that is less than probably 2 minutes to paint that. Finally, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show you how I'd finish this drawing off. So here we have some gouache. Gouache is water soluble, well not water soluble, but it's a pigment, and you can dilute it. Now, but what I want to do is I want to add some colour to it. So I want to add a little bit of the quinacridone gold, and I'm going to mix that with just a tiny bit of water, and that's going to make it a bit easier to paint on, and it won't paint on in a really big horrible clag, if you know what I mean. It'll paint on a lot more like sort of watercolour paint and not so much like oil. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this white, and I'm going to dilute it a tiny bit more, and I'm just going to reinstate some of these lines here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the white, oh, you can see here, probably can't see so much, the bright white, and I'm going to add that in around the edge here. But again, I'm not going to go around specifically doing a perfect line, because I want it to be slightly uneven. In fact, you could almost sort of add a few little details just to try and break up areas like that. So the reason why I did the quinacridone here is because I want to do the same, but further away. Now, I'm not sure that's 100% worked for that one, but it's interesting just to add a little bit of extra details and things in the sky. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. One of the things you find if you get backlit clouds is they tend to have a sort of a white halo around them. So there you go, that was a lot of fun. You get some really interesting effects when you start lifting off things. You can get swoops, some rays, fluffy clouds. There's an awful lot to explore, but the great thing about all these techniques that I'm showing you, blowing my own trumpet here, is they're fun to practice. So you can do 10 different small, skies on one page and just practice and go down, and practice in each one, try something different. You learn so much quicker than sitting down and doing long, lengthy paintings. The best thing I learned really about doing skies is what you do is you'll do a drawing or a sketch in my case, or whatever you want to call it, a building or a ship or whatever, and it can take you an hour to do that drawing, you know. And then you go to put the sky in, and all of a sudden you feel that stress, you know, you feel your heart going because you're like, I don't want to ruin this really good drawing. And I don't think that's the right way to do it. If you don't have necessarily the confidence and you want to learn some of this stuff, I think the best way to do it is to do 10 blocks, 10 squares on one big bit of paper, or, you know, one on each small bit of paper, and just do a simple silhouette of a lighthouse or whatever, and then just do sky after sky after sky. Don't invest a lot of time in the drawing, but play and make mistakes and put too much water on or too much paint on, or try different things, try some different colours, try doing some really contrasting colours. You can have a lot of fun with it. You know, use some tissue to lift stuff off. Even now, when I come to do a sky on a piece, if I've spent a lot of time drawing, I'll do a couple of practice skies, almost like value studies, and it'll warm me up and get me back into the sort of looseness of it. So, you know, don't be afraid to play. As always, play is, you know, vital. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Ta-ra, bye-bye.